They thought they had him. The HOA board, smug and arrogant, convinced themselves this was going to be easy. A clean win. They figured they'd crush my grandson Lucas in court, drown him in legal jargon and endless fees, bury him under technicalities until he'd have no choice but to surrender. To them, he was just a kid, 19 years old, disabled, alone, grieving the sudden loss of both his parents, barely holding on to the house they left behind. That's exactly the scenario the HOA had been waiting for. And now they thought they had him cornered. What they didn't know, what they refused to see, was that Lucas wasn't someone you could back into a corner and expect to break. They underestimated him from the start, and by the time they realized it, it was far too late. I'm his grandfather, and this is how my grandson turned the tables on people who thought they could destroy him. The courtroom was tense. You could feel it in the air, thick like a thunderstorm ready to break. Every seat was filled, people murmuring quietly, craning their necks to get a better view. Some came for the spectacle, expecting to see a young man crushed under the weight of bureaucracy and greed. Others whispered to each other, convinced they already knew how it was going to end. Lucas didn't have a chance, they said. Not against them, not today. At the front, row after row of HOA board members sat with their arms crossed. Their lawyers, all sharp suits and smug smiles, traded glances like they were in on some private joke. You could practically hear them popping champagne in their heads. It was already won, as far as they were concerned. And then there was Lucas. He sat at the defendant's table, dwarfed by the heavy wood. His crutches leaned against the side, untouched. He could have used them for support. Lord knows his body was still healing from the accident that changed his life. But he didn't. That was his quiet statement. They wouldn't see him as weak today. Not today. He sat still, his shoulders slightly hunched, but not from fear, from the weight he carried. Just months before he'd lost everything, his parents, his family, his future. In one rain-slicked moment, their car was gone. Laughter turned to screams, headlights blinding in the dark, metal crushing in around them. Lucas survived, barely, but he didn't walk away unscarred. His body held reminders of that night, injuries that would never let him forget. His heart? Well, that was something no surgery could fix. And now the home his parents worked themselves to the bone to provide was under threat. The place where his mom planted her rose bushes every spring, where his dad taught him to ride a bike. It was all he had left, and the HOA wanted it, badly. They didn't even try to hide it. They were cold about it, calculated. They moved the fence line inch by inch, stealing his property like they thought he wouldn't notice. They fined him for made-up violations, flaking paint, a wheelchair ramp they claimed wasn't approved. They slapped on fees so high, so fast it would have made your head spin. They figured he didn't have the money to fight back. They were counting on it. But it wasn't just about money. No, they had a long game in mind. They were running out the clock, bleeding him dry. The plan was simple. Keep hitting him with fines, legal threats, and lawsuits until he missed a payment. Then they'd swoop in and take the house for pennies on the dollar, sell it to one of their own, kick the kid to the curb and call it business. One of their board members even told Lucas that before the hearing, smirked right in his face and said, "Listen, kid, this isn't personal. You don't have the money. We do. Why drag this out? You're going to lose." Lucas didn't answer him. He just looked at the man, memorized that smug look, and filed it away. He'd wipe it off soon enough. They'd made one big mistake. They thought Lucas was alone. They thought he was broken, but they didn't know the fire still burning inside him. They didn't know how much his father had taught him about the law. They didn't know how sharp his mind was, how relentless he could be. They figured they were playing chess against a kid still learning how to move the pieces. In reality, they'd just handed their queen to a master, the so-called friends from the neighborhood, the same ones who hugged Lucas at his parents' funeral, who brought casseroles and promised to look out for him. Where were they now? Nowhere. Silent. They stood by while the HOA came after him. They didn't warn him. They didn't stand up for him. When fear rules a place, kindness hides. That's how it was in this neighborhood. The HOA always won. Until now, Garrett Caldwell was the HOA's lead attorney. Sleek, expensive, polished like the walnut table he sat behind. He leaned back in his chair like he already had Lucas's house keys in his pocket. His fingers drummed lazily against the wood as he looked Lucas up and down, that smirk never leaving his face. "So let me get this straight," Garrett said, his voice dripping with fake concern. "You think you can argue this case by yourself?" The HOA side of the room chuckled. Little laughs, whispers, like this was some comedy show. Lucas just sat there still, not a twitch, not a blink. Garrett sighed dramatically, flipping through his folder like he was reviewing a lunch menu. "Your Honor," he said, dragging out the words, "let's not waste everyone's time. Mr. Dawson is in clear violation of the HOA rules. We all know how this ends." He slammed a fat stack of papers onto the table. "He's built an unauthorized wheelchair ramp. Ugly, unapproved. Affects property values," Garrett said, like he was talking about weeds in a garden. He turned another page. "He's refused to comply with fence adjustments. The HOA remapped property lines. He didn't follow them. He's trespassing." Lucas clenched his jaw but didn't speak. Garrett leaned back again, clearly enjoying himself. "This isn't personal, Your Honor, but rules are rules, and Mr. Dawson here has broken them." He even gave the jury a little head shake, like he was scolding a dog that peed on the carpet. Garrett wrapped it all up with a smirk. "Frankly, Your Honor, this young man is desperately clinging to something that isn't his anymore." For a second, the courtroom was dead quiet, and then Lucas moved. He picked up his crutches and stood, slow and steady. You could hear the soft thump as the rubber tips hit the floor with each step. He moved toward the center, every motion deliberate, like he was drawing a line in the sand. Judge Reeves, a stone-faced man, raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Dawson," he said, "do you have an attorney?" Lucas shook his head. "I'll be representing myself." That got a reaction. Garrett laughed out loud. One of the other lawyers slapped a hand over his mouth, pretending not to grin. Even a few people in the gallery shook their heads. This was going to be a slaughter. They could already see it, but the judge didn't smile. He tapped his pen against the desk, his eyes narrowing just slightly. "Proceed." Lucas nodded. Then he did something no one expected. He went straight for Garrett's claim. "Mr. Caldwell," Lucas said, "you stated that the HOA's investigator personally witnessed me violating the property line, correct?" Garrett rolled his eyes. "That's right." "And that's documented in the report?" Lucas asked. "Obviously," Garrett replied. Lucas nodded. Then he turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I move to dismiss that testimony." There was a pause. The kind of pause where the room holds its breath. "On what grounds?" the judge asked. Lucas's voice was calm. "Because the investigator wasn't there. He couldn't have witnessed anything. He was out of state the entire day." That's when everything shifted. Murmurs broke out in the gallery. Garrett sat forward, confusion flickering across his face. "That's not—" he started, but Lucas wasn't done. "I have travel records," Lucas said. "Flight logs, hotel receipts, all legally obtained. He wasn't here. He lied in the report." For the first time, Garrett didn't look so smug. He sat there stunned. The HOA board members whispered furiously among themselves. Lucas took another step forward. "Your Honor, if the court allows, I have additional evidence showing the HOA's actions were not only unethical but illegal." And just like that, the room was his. Lucas laid out the paperwork with a quiet confidence that filled the room. He wasn't cocky. He wasn't smug. He was steady, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. "This," Lucas said, sliding the first document forward, "is an independent land survey I had conducted last month. It proves the original property line, the one that existed before the HOA redrew their maps without consent." You could hear the air leave Garrett Caldwell's lungs. His fingers twitched slightly as he flipped through his files like maybe he'd missed something. He hadn't. He was just hoping. Lucas placed a second document down, just as carefully. "And here," he continued, "is the original HOA contract signed by my parents. It explicitly states that no property lines can be adjusted without the homeowner's written approval." The gallery was quiet now, too quiet. Even the jurors who'd spent most of the morning bored stiff were leaning in. Judge Reeves took the documents, his face unreadable, but his eyes scanning every line. Slowly, thoroughly. Lucas didn't stop there. He wasn't about to give them room to recover. "I'd also like to submit this," Lucas said, lifting a printout of an email and placing it squarely on the evidence table. "It's an internal HOA email sent between board members." He let that hang in the air for just a second longer. "In it," Lucas said, his voice steady but cold, "they discuss a plan. Quote, the Dawson boy can't fight this. He doesn't have the money. Keep the pressure on until he sells." That was the moment it changed. You could feel the weight of it. The slow, creeping realization spreading through every person in that courtroom. Garrett Caldwell's face lost all color. The HOA board members shifted in their seats, their carefully practiced poker faces slipping into something closer to panic. The treasurer, Mrs. Langford, fumbled through her files like maybe she could find something to explain it away. But there was nothing to find. Lucas had found it all. Judge Reeves read the email, his jaw tightening. He read it again, slower this time. His grip on the paper firmed until his knuckles whitened. And then he looked up. Not at Lucas, at Garrett. "Mr. Caldwell," the judge said, his tone suddenly heavier, "are you prepared to challenge the authenticity of this document?" Garrett hesitated. Just a second, but it was a second too long. The courtroom smelled blood. Lucas stayed quiet. He didn't need to say anything. The evidence was doing the speaking for him now. The judge tapped his gavel once. Sharp, loud. "Motion to dismiss the HOA's claims is granted." You could have heard a pin drop. And then Garrett tried to speak. "Objection, Your Honor," he stammered, but his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. He straightened his tie like he was still in control, but anyone looking at him knew the truth. He was spiraling. The judge didn't bother hiding his disdain now. "Overruled." That one word felt final, heavy as the sound of the gavel. Garrett opened his mouth again, probably to argue, but no words came out. He sat down slowly like he wasn't sure his legs could hold him up anymore. And then Judge Reeves turned his gaze toward the HOA board members. His eyes narrowed. "I suggest," he said, his voice dangerously calm, "you and your clients prepare yourselves. If this email is authentic, this court isn't the last place you'll be answering for it." At that, the whispers turned into a dull roar. The gallery buzzed with murmurs, reporters scribbling furiously, even the jurors exchanging wide-eyed glances. Lucas stood there still, breathing deep. This wasn't relief. This wasn't celebration. This was the clarity of knowing he had been right all along. The HOA was cooked. Margaret, my wife, clutched my hand tighter. Her eyes shimmered with tears she'd held back for months. She whispered, "He did it." But the words broke halfway through. He did. Garrett Caldwell slumped in his seat, hands limp on the table, the bravado gone. One of the board members, the same guy who told Lucas this was just business, leaned toward him in a panic. "We need to settle," he hissed. "Now." But there was no settling. It was too late for that. Lucas turned then, finally glancing toward us, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something on his face. Not arrogance, not relief, but peace. He moved slowly back to his seat, his crutches clicking softly with every step, while chaos churned all around him. He didn't look at the HOA board members again. He didn't have to. They knew. Judge Reeves shook his head like he was still piecing it together. Then he leaned forward. "Case dismissed." The gavel came down hard. Final. I don't remember standing. One moment I was seated. The next I was across the room. Margaret too. She got to Lucas first, wrapping him in a hug so tight I thought she might snap the crutches in two. "You did it," she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You did it, sweetheart." I put my hand on his shoulder. Steady, firm. "Your father would be proud," I said, feeling the weight of it in my throat. Lucas looked at me, just for a moment, his eyes wet but clear. He nodded. No words needed. The courtroom emptied slowly. The HOA board members slinked away like shadows at sunset, trying to avoid the reporters swarming outside. But Garrett wasn't fast enough. Cameras found him. Microphones found him. And for the first time all day, he had nothing to say. Lucas didn't wait around for the press. He never wanted the spotlight. He didn't smile for the cameras. Didn't gloat. He just moved toward us, one slow step at a time. As we walked out of the courtroom together, Judge Reeves was standing by his car. He watched us. For a second, I thought he was going to leave. But then he turned, walking straight toward Lucas. He stopped a few feet away, cleared his throat. "Mr. Dawson," he said. Lucas turned, his face unreadable. "You should consider law school," the judge said. And for the first time all day, I saw a flicker of a real smile cross Lucas's face. Small, brief, but there. "I don't want to just study law," Lucas said quietly. "I want to change it." Judge Reeves nodded, then he walked away. Lucas turned back to us. Margaret put her arm around him, and we left. Outside, reporters still shouted questions we didn't answer. Cameras still flashed. But Lucas wasn't paying attention. The courthouse was shrinking behind us as we walked to the car. Margaret opened the door for him. He slid into the passenger seat without a word. I started the engine. As I drove, I glanced over at him. "You sure you're all right, kid?" Lucas was quiet for a while. Then he nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "But this isn't over." I smiled, not because I doubted him, but because I believed him. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Lucas had won this round. He'd kept his parents home, exposed the corruption, made them pay for underestimating him. But now he knew there were others out there. People who didn't have the knowledge. People who didn't know how to fight back. Lucas had found his purpose in that courtroom, and I had no doubt. He was going to spend the rest of his life fighting for people like him, people who were never supposed to win. And this was just the beginning. The courthouse was behind us now, but it felt like Lucas was still carrying the weight of it as we drove. He stared out the window most of the way home. Quiet, but I knew his mind was working. Lucas was never the type to sit still. Not really, not inside his head. Even when he was a boy, he'd take things apart just to see how they worked. Toy cars, radios. One time, even the washing machine. His dad had laughed about it for days. Said Lucas didn't just want to fix things. He wanted to understand why they broke in the first place. That's exactly what I saw in him now. That same restless curiosity, only sharper, hungrier. This wasn't over. Not for Lucas. Not even close. By the time we pulled into the driveway, I could see the old house waiting for us. The home his parents had built together. The paint was chipped in places. The garden was overgrown where his mom's roses used to bloom. But it stood, solid. It was his now. His to protect. His to rebuild. Margaret squeezed his hand as he stepped out of the car. "We're proud of you," she said. "You know that, right?" Lucas gave a small nod. His eyes were distant, like he was still halfway back in that courtroom. We helped him inside, even though he insisted he could do it on his own. Stubborn as ever. He paused in the doorway for a long time, looking around like he was seeing it all for the first time. The photos on the wall, his mom's cross-stitch framed in the hallway, his dad's old jacket still hanging by the door. This house wasn't just bricks and wood. It was them. It was every memory he had left. And for a while he just stood there, breathing it in. I didn't rush him. Neither did Margaret. We just stood back and let him have that moment. After a while, Lucas moved to the kitchen table, pulled out a chair, and sat down. He took a thick folder from his backpack, laying it flat on the table. Pages spilled out. Notes, highlighted passages, copies of laws and rulings. Margaret glanced at me like she wanted to say something, but she didn't. She knew as well as I did what he was thinking. He was already planning his next move. Later that night, I found him still there, poring over papers. He had his dad's old reading glasses perched on his nose. Even though they were a little too big for him, he must have found them in a drawer somewhere. I stood in the doorway for a while just watching. He didn't notice me at first, completely locked into what he was doing. "You thinking about law school?" I asked finally, keeping my voice low. Lucas didn't look up right away. He finished underlining something before setting his pen down. "I don't know," he said, but he did. I could hear it in his voice. "You'd be good at it," I said. "Damn good." Lucas gave a faint smile. I keep thinking about all the people who don't have someone to fight for them. People like me." "You're not like them," I said. "You fought back. You won." He looked at me then, his eyes sharp. Exactly. And there it was. His answer. clear as day. I sat down across from him, groaning a little as my knees cracked. "You know," I said, "your dad always said you were going to do something big. He just didn't know what yet." Lucas smiled at that. Not much, just a little, but it was there. We sat like that for a while, quiet, comfortable, like we both understood what was coming without needing to say it out loud. The next few days were a blur. Word spread fast in a town like ours. By the time Lucas stepped outside to get the mail, people were driving by slower than usual. Some waved, others didn't, but they all looked. They knew. The story had gotten out, and not just here. Reporters came back. A local news van parked across the street for 2 days straight, waiting for Lucas to give a statement. He didn't. He had no interest in playing their game. But it wasn't just them. Letters started arriving, emails, messages from people he didn't even know. Some from across the state, a few from other parts of the country, people who'd been through the same thing. HOAs pushing them out, lawyers bleeding them dry. Some lost their homes. Others were still fighting. One letter stuck with me. It was from an older woman, handwritten, shaky in places. She said her husband had died last year. The HOA started coming after her a month later. Fines for ridiculous things. They told her she wasn't keeping her lawn short enough, that her garden was a mess, that her driveway was cracked. They fined her for every little thing until she couldn't keep up. Then they took her house. "I wish I had known what to do," she wrote, "but I didn't. Nobody told me." Lucas read that letter twice. Then he folded it carefully and slid it into a drawer. He didn't say anything about it after that, but I knew. That was it. That was the moment he decided. 2 weeks later, I found him applying to 3 different law schools. He'd written his personal statement without asking anyone to read it. Didn't even tell Margaret. But I caught him printing it out one night. "You tell them you want to tear the whole system down?" I asked. Lucas gave me a look. "Something like that." We laughed. First time in a while. But Lucas didn't wait for law school to start helping people. Word got out that he knew property law, that he'd beaten his HOA. People started coming to the house. Some knocked on the door. Others left messages asking for advice. Lucas never turned them away. He sat with them, listened to their stories, told them what they could do. It started small. A couple of folks from the neighborhood, then people from the next town over. One man came all the way from 3 counties away. He sat at our kitchen table for 2 hours while Lucas walked him through everything he needed to challenge his HOA's bogus claims. Margaret started making extra coffee every morning, just in case someone showed up needing help. And they did, almost every day. I watched Lucas change, not all at once, but slowly. He carried himself different, stood a little taller. His voice had weight now, like someone who knew they had something to say and people were finally listening. He never talked much about what happened in court after that. He didn't need to. We all saw it. We all knew. But there were moments when I caught him looking at the house, quiet, his expression softening, like he was remembering something. One evening we were sitting on the porch. The sun was going down, painting everything in that deep orange light. Lucas was quiet, sipping coffee, staring out across the yard. "You think they'll ever try again?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. "No," he said finally. "They know better now." But the way he said it told me something else. If they did, he was ready. Margaret came out a little later, settling into her chair beside us. "I heard from Mrs. Langford today," she said casually. Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" Margaret nodded. "She's selling her house, moving." Lucas didn't say anything. He just gave a small nod and went back to his coffee. Turns out a lot of the HOA board members were leaving, quietly, one by one. The pressure was too much. Investigations had started. Lawsuits were brewing. What they'd done to Lucas wasn't unique. They'd been doing it for years. Lucas just happened to be the first one who fought back, and won. And now the house was his. The land was his. No more letters. No more fines. Just quiet. But Lucas wasn't settling. He was just getting started. A few months later, he got an acceptance letter. Full ride to a law school upstate. I remember the way his hands shook just slightly when he opened it. Not from fear, from excitement. He'd earned this. Every piece of it. Margaret hugged him tight. I clapped him on the back so hard I thought I might knock him over. But he smiled. Big. For the first time in what felt like years. "This is it," he said. I nodded. Damn right. And as we stood there, in the doorway of the house his parents built, I realized something. Lucas wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who couldn't. And something told me he was going to make one hell of a lawyer. The day Lucas left for law school, the house felt different. Quieter, not empty, just different. He didn't take much with him. Just a few bags, some books, and his father's old briefcase, worn leather, still carrying the faint smell of tobacco from years ago. Margaret cried. Of course. She hugged him like she was afraid to let go. I kept it together until he pulled out of the driveway, crutches balanced on the passenger seat, windows down, music low. The moment his car turned the corner, I had to sit down. Legs just gave out. We didn't hear much from him the first few weeks. He was busy. Calls came late, after long days of classes and longer nights of studying. But every time he called, he sounded different. Sharper, more focused, the kind of focus you only get when you know exactly why you're doing something. Margaret would sit on the phone with him, smiling the whole time, nodding along to his stories about lectures and debates and late-night study groups. She always hung up with that same quiet look in her eyes. Pride, sure, but something more. Like she knew he wasn't just studying to be a lawyer, he was becoming one, and he wasn't wasting time. By his second semester, Lucas was already helping people. He joined a legal clinic at school, working with tenants being bullied by landlords, HOAs trying the same garbage his had, people who didn't have the money or the knowledge to fight back. Lucas sat with them, explained their rights, wrote letters, filed paperwork. He made sure they weren't alone. One case stuck out. A single mother with 2 kids. Her HOA fined her every week for improper landscaping. She lived in an apartment. No yard, no garden. But they wanted her gone. Lucas found the loophole they didn't see. Got the fines reversed. Filed a complaint that stuck. They left her alone after that. When he called to tell us about it, I could hear it in his voice. The way it steadied as he told the story. Like he'd finally found where he belonged. Years passed faster than I thought they would. The house got quieter, but it was still filled with life. Margaret tended the garden again, planted new roses beside the old ones. I fixed up the fence with Lucas's tools, the same fence they'd tried to use against him. And Lucas? He finished law school top of his class. When he graduated, he wore his dad's tie. The old one faded that his father used to wear when he went to court as a paralegal. Lucas stood taller that day than I'd ever seen him. His name was called. He stepped up, shook hands, smiled for the cameras. Not because he wanted to, because he knew it mattered. He came home after that, just for a little while. Sat on the porch with us again. Margaret made him his favorite dinner. We laughed like we hadn't in years, but he wasn't done. Not yet. He passed the bar on his first try. No surprise to anyone who knew him. The offers came in fast after that. Big firms, names you hear on the news. Places with money, power. He turned them all down. Lucas started his own practice instead. Small, simple, right here in town. The sign on the door wasn't fancy. Dawson Law. That was it. People came. At first, just a few. Neighbors who remembered what he'd done. Then more. Word spread. He was the lawyer who didn't charge a dime unless you won. The one who returned calls at 11 p.m. The one who sat with you in court like you were the most important case of his life. Because to him, you were. The HOA that tried to take his house, dissolved, gone, bankrupted by lawsuits and investigations. Most of the board members skipped town long before that. No one missed them. Lucas never gloated. He never brought it up. But he kept their old letters, the fines, the threats, in a drawer in his office. A reminder maybe, or a warning. Years later, I watched him argue a case in a courtroom bigger than the one where he fought for his house. Cameras lined the back wall. Reporters scribbled notes. He stood there in his dark suit, steady as a mountain. His voice didn't waver. His arguments cut through the air like a scalpel. The HOA on the other side of the room looked terrified. I couldn't blame them. He won that case too. And the ones after that, he kept winning because they still underestimated him and because he never stopped fighting. Lucas told me once, long after it all, why he did it. They don't expect people like me to win, he said, so I make it impossible for them not to notice when I do. And they noticed. Oh, they noticed. He didn't stop with HOAs. He took on big companies, crooked landlords, insurance scams, anyone who thought they could bury the little guy under paperwork and fees and fear. Lucas fought them all. His name became known, not famous, not the kind you see on billboards, but the kind people whispered to each other when they needed help. Call Dawson, they said. He'll fight for you. And he did. There's a photo on his office wall now. Not of him, not his diplomas. It's his parents, standing on the porch of their house, arms around each other, smiling. It was taken the summer before the accident. Lucas told me he looks at it before every case. Reminds him why he does this. One day, years later, Lucas came by the house, sat on the porch again. His hair had some gray in it now, his hands rough from years of work, but his eyes were the same, sharp, focused. You did good, kid, I told him. He shook his head. Still work to do. He was right. There always was. But if you ask me, he'd already done more than enough. Margaret brought out iced tea. We sat there, three of us, watching the sun set over the house they tried to take from him. And failed. Lucas still carried his father's old briefcase, still used the same worn desk in his office, still walked with his crutches, steady as ever. But now people stood when he entered a room. They listened when he spoke. He became exactly who his parents raised him to be, and more. And every time I see him walk into that courtroom, I know one thing for sure. Lucas Dawson was never just fighting for himself. He was fighting for all of us. And he's still winning.